Hello and welcome to the last lecture of week 4. So we're getting along. Summer moves fast. So here, this lecture is going to be about social contract theory, another approach to ethics. So it's typically associated with Thomas Hobbes as a sort of an originator, who again is one of these sort of early modern philosophers. So we've sort of, as looking back, right, we've criticized the approach that says God is the source of morality. We've criticized the approach that says, well, there's some sort of like natural law or natural order, right, that tells us what to do. Um, so if sort of religion or some, natural sort of inherent rationality in the universe is not the source of morality, where else might it be? Um, you might suppose, right, that it could come from sort of literally nothing, right? You don't need to necessarily um, invoke God or write some sort of thick metaphysical machinery to explain it, right? You could explain it even if people were inherently totally selfish, right? And we saw a glimmer of this approach in the last lecture on ethical egoism, right? So um, in reality, it's probably not true, as we saw, that people are in fact inherently selfish, or at least a little bit selfish, right? I think we can all admit that. So Hobbes sort of offers an account of how morality could evolve, right? Even if there was no God, no natural order, or not even necessarily any inherent goodness in people from which it could grow. Morality could develop purely out of the interaction of totally self-interested human beings. So let's suppose for the moment that this is the case, right? And we just have a bunch of self-interested individuals out there, right? Um, we can sort of like peer back in time, and this is sort of a mythical time. We don't really know, right, what it was like, and um, it's almost certainly the case that people weren't entirely self-interested, right? But again, um, suppose that they were. Suppose that was all we had to work with, right? Some primeval world populated by humans, and all they care about is their own preservation. Um, Hobbes calls this the state of nature, right? And he thinks existence in a state of nature would be terrible. And so here's a quote which has a the last line is very famous. You'll probably run into it over and over again in your life. But he says, in the state of nature, quote, there would be no place for industry because the fruit thereof is uncertain, right? So you can work real hard on something, but you never know if it'll just get taken from you, right? Consequently, no culture of the earth, so you can't develop into a greater culture. No navigation or use of commodities that may be imported by sea. Again, you can't make trade deals, right? If people are just, if there's no rules, right? No laws. No commodious building. You can't have very complex architecture, right? No instruments of moving and removing, such as require much force. No knowledge of the face of the earth. No account of time. No arts. No letters. No society. And, which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish. So he says, in this very beginning, where all you've got is just bunch of separate individuals all interested in themselves, you can't develop much of what we would recognize as human life. You're just always on edge, never knowing if you're going to get murdered or stolen from at any moment. So Hobbes paints a pretty nasty picture of what the state of nature would be like. Um, we might ask, is there any reason to think that it actually would be like that? Hobbes does give a few reasons. Um, First of all, equality of need. What he means by this is that as humans, we all more or less are looking for the same things. We all need the same resources, same types of foods. We all need water. Um, we all need shelter and so on, right? Now, that wouldn't in itself be a big problem if it weren't for number two, the scarcity of resources. So uh, the amount of these commodities that we all need is limited, so there's never going to be enough to go around, right? Um, and then we have the essential equality of human power. So humans are, some are bigger than others, but they're roughly right? Equal in strength, power, size. Certainly, even if there's one real big guy in the room, two or three of us could get together, take him down. So you're never going to get sort of a natural hierarchy where there's like permanent winners and losers who don't no longer try to challenge the winners, and sort of, society settles down into its roles. He thinks there's going to be constant turmoil, right? And then four, limited altruism, right? If none of this would be a problem if people were sort of naturally very good or very kind to each other, but Hobbes doesn't think that's the case, right? And when it comes down to it's my life or yours, we can't really count on other people to look out for us, right? So these four factors combined, Hobbes thinks, gives you a situation of constant war, right, over these limited resources. Maybe one day you win the battle, maybe you get lucky for a little while, but you're always watching your back, and it's an unpleasant sort of situation. And it's not so far-fetched, right? We have seen similar situations throughout history, right? When you have sort of a civil war and society collapses, and right, a certain sort of social structure dissolves, you see a sort of state of nature. You do see some terrible things going on until we can sort of coalesce again to something more like a society, normal society again. So Hobbes thinks that for creatures like us, the only way out of the state of nature is for us to come together and come to some agreement, right? Um, and he thinks that's possible, right? If everybody wants a greater degree of stability, they want some more predictability, they might be willing to sacrifice what they could gain, right, from a state of nature for like a sort of a greater good, right? So something like, look, I'll agree not to steal from you, and maybe I could make out better if I sort of didn't agree not to steal from you, but I also don't have to worry about people stealing from me, right? So if we just make an agreement, I can stop sleeping with one eye open, right? Um, Now I can go out and do other stuff, right? I can work the soil, I can hunt, right? There's plenty of things I can do besides stealing to make a living, and then I'll feel confident about that what I get, I'll be able to keep it. I might even, in that sort of situation, feel safe enough that I'd even be willing to help someone else if they need it, right? He thinks that altruism will only start to emerge once you feel relatively safe, right? If your life is no longer on the line, now you can start uh, acting altruistically. So we can now, I think, with that background, define social contract theory, which is this: morality consists in the set of rules governing behavior that rational people will accept on the condition that others accept them as well. So for Hobbes, morality is a sort of deal you make. Um, Another approach that gives us sort of the same answer here, and it's a little more sort of recent game theoretic scenario called the prisoner's dilemma, um, is also a sort of argument for social contract theory. So it's worth looking at the prisoner's dilemma. So the scenario is this: suppose that you live in a totalitarian country, right? And the police have arrested you, and they've accused you of plotting against the government with another person. Let's call that person Smith, right? Um, so you say, look, I've done no such thing, right? I'm not plotting against the government. I don't even know any Smith. I don't know what you're talking about. But the police don't care. Look, at the end of the day, they don't even really care that much about the truth, right? They just want to convict someone. So they offer you a deal. So here's the deal, right? If Smith doesn't confess, but you confess and testify against him, they'll release you. You just totally go free, and Smith is going to get 10 years in jail. Right? Now, if Smith confesses and you don't, he gets the same deal, right? He'll go free. You'll get 10 years in jail. Um, the other thing that could happen, if you both confess, well, you'll both just get sentenced to 5 years. And then if neither of you confesses, well, there just won't be any evidence at all to convict either of you. They can hold you for up to a year according to the laws of that country, but then they're going to have to let you both go after a year. And finally, they tell you, look, Smith's getting the same deal we're offering you, but you can't talk to him, right? And you have no idea what he's going to do. So hopefully that's clear. Um, if you're not clear on the options, maybe pause it, like read through it again, right? Because it's good to, you need to sort of get those clear in your mind. But I'm going to move on. So what should you do, right, if you're this prisoner? Let's suppose you're not, again, you're a self-interested, right? You don't really care about Smith. You just want to get the best deal for yourself. So what is the ideal strategy? Now you might think, well, since I have no idea what Smith does, it's hard to say, right? Um, there is, in fact, a sort of like a rigorously provable solution for the problem. And this is that no matter what you do, you should confess. So why is that the case? Well, look, first, either Smith is going to confess or he isn't, right? So let's suppose Smith confesses. Um, well, if you confess too, you only get 5 years, whereas if Smith confesses and you don't, you get 10. So if Smith confesses, you'd better confess, right? So what's the other option? Well, Smith might not confess. Well, in that case, if you confess, you go free, right? But if you don't confess, you get 1 year. So even if Smith doesn't confess, you're also better off confessing. So whatever Smith does, you're better off confessing, right? So um, it's actually fairly straightforward what you should do, right? You should confess. Regardless of what Smith does, that's going to get you the best option. But the tricky thing about this is not what you're going to end up with in practice is not a very optimal solution, right? Um, because if Smith is as smart as you, right, and makes the same calculations as you, he's going to confess too. And what's going to happen? You'll both confess, and you'll each get 5 years, right? Um, but there was a better option out there, right? If you had both held firm and not confessed, then you each would have only gotten 1 year. So if only you could have communicated with Smith, made some sort of deal, right, some sort of contract, um, right, you could have both gotten off with only 1 year. But you really have to hope that Smith is going to stick to that deal, right? Because if you confess and he doesn't, he goes free, you get 10 years. So what you need is an agreement, but also an enforceable one, right? So we can sort of take this logic of the prisoner's dilemma and sort of apply it to our own everyday lives, right? So how should I behave in everyday life, right? Should I act selfishly or should I act benevolently, right? Um, well, again, if you're a purely self-interested, uh, the choice will just depend on what gets you the best outcome, right? And that's going to depend on how others behave. And again, you have these four possibilities that seem to mirror the prisoner's dilemma. I could act selfishly while other people act benevolently, right? I could act benevolently while others act selfishly. Everyone could act selfishly, or everyone could act benevolently, right? So these are the four options. So it seems like, right, if I'm purely self-interested, A is the best outcome for me, right? Everyone else, right, is good and doesn't steal, and then I can go around and steal from whoever I want, so I get more stuff, right? Um, B seems like it would be the worst outcome, right? So I'm good and I don't steal from people, but everybody rips me off. That's the worst for me. Uh, D would be the second best, right? If everyone acts benevolently, at least I don't get stolen from, even though I don't get to steal from others. And then third seems everyone acts selfishly. That's basically the state of nature, right? And we've seen in Hobbes, that's pretty bad too. Maybe not as bad as trying to be good while you're in the state of nature, right? But still pretty bad. But we end up in the same situation as the prisoner's dilemma, right? So it seems like, okay, well, whatever people do, I should act selfishly, right? Because again, whether if people are benevolent and I act selfishly, I get the best outcome there. If people aren't benevolent, if other people are selfish, well, I better act selfish too. I'll get taken advantage of less, right? So it seems like, okay, best solution, acting selfishly. But again, other people, right, can do the same math. They're going to come to the conclusion, well, whatever happens, I should act selfishly, right? And you've left all of you have left a better option on the table, right, by not getting together and making an agreement. If you could all come to some agreement, you could all get the second best outcome, which is when everyone acts benevolently, right? So you don't get the benefits of stealing from people, but you get all the benefits of living in a civilized society where you don't have to watch your back all the time, right? So it seems like, right, you can bargain your way into morality, right? Just being self-interested, if everyone can get together, right, and talk it out, you'll all agree uh, to just be kind to each other and benevolent, and the demands of morality sort of match up with what's actually in your best interest in the real world, right? So that's interesting, right? We don't need God, we don't need natural order. All we need is sort of like just self-interested beings scattered around the world, right? And just sort of the laws of logic and game theory will get us to where we all agree to act according to certain moral rules. Um, so this is the, again, social contract theory. Moral rules are rules that rational people would accept so long as everyone else accepts them. Um, that seems to solve, right, some important puzzles about morality. Um, First of all, we want to know, if you want to know, okay, what should I do, right? That was the basic question. What are the moral rules and what aren't they? Do I ask God? Do I consult the Bible, right? Do I do a utilitarian calculus? Um, well, social contract theory sort of gives us a procedure for determining what those rules are. Now, you can't actually get the whole world together and get them to agree on worlds or on rules or like survey everyone in the world, but you can sort of run it hypothetically, right? Um, Stealing will probably come out wrong, right? Because everyone is going to agree, yeah, I don't want to get stolen from. I'm not going to steal from you. That seems like a good deal for me, right? So stealing comes out wrong on social contract theory, which is, I think, what we want, right? Um, but other stuff, right, that's sort of like, is this immoral or not, where there seems to be debate over it, social contract theory also gives us some clear answers, right? Um, Homosexuality, for example, doesn't seem like a problem on the social contract theory, right? Um, I don't, right? I don't need to agree with you that no one's going to be gay. Like it doesn't really hurt me if some people decide to be gay, right? Now, of course, there will be people out there that argue that it would have some sort of bad effect on society, right? Um, but now we have it. Now it's just a straightforward empirical question: is it bad for society or not? Right? We could sort of potentially figure that out. It's no longer a sort of deep, abstract, normative question, but just a question of what's good or bad for society. And if it turns out that yeah, homosexuality doesn't have any bad effects, then fine, it's fine on according to social. Um, Another thing that social contract theory gives us is an explicit connection between morality and rationality. Right? We've been pushing this the whole course. Moral like rules should have reasons for them. Right? We should be able to say, if I say you should do that or you shouldn't do that, you should be able to ask why. And I should be able to give you a convincing reason. And um, social contract, that connection is very intimate, right? Morality just is the rules that rational people agree on. Right? Social contract theory also has something to say about when we should break the rules. So, when can we break the social contract? Well, when someone else has, right? So if someone steals, okay, we can take something from them in return, right? We'll fine them, right, or put them in jail, take some of their freedom away, right? Um, this is kind of exactly what we do in a society when people break certain rules. They've taken themselves out of the social contract, so okay, you're no longer party to the deal. We don't have to treat you right with the same according to those rules anymore since you broke them first. Social contract theory also has something to say about sort of how demanding morality has to be, right? We've run into this with some, like utilitarianism seems to like, okay, anytime I do anything, I have to think about all the effects on the whole world, right? Or deontology says, look, you can never lie, period, that sort of thing, right? Um, uh, so what about social contract theory in this respect, right? Does social contract theory entail that you should have to kill your mom to save five people's lives or something like that? Um, it you might think so at first, right? Because you might think, well, wouldn't society be better off if we make it a rule to always sort of make sure that everything is to the benefit of the most people, right? So we should make it a rule that yeah, if you can kill one to save five, you should always do it. That's best for society. Um, but remember, the social contract is agreement people would actually make, rational people would follow, right? And so if rational humans have some sort of psychological difficulty about sacrificing their mothers or their grandmothers, then they're not going to agree to those rules, right? Um, so social contract theory actually wouldn't probably entail that you're forced to sacrifice your mom to save five, right? Because even rational people wouldn't agree to that, arguably. Right? Okay, so those are some of the advantages of social contract theory, right? It seems to make sense of a lot of our sort of the puzzles. It seems less extreme in many ways than some of the other theories. Uh, there is an apparent problem about the notion of civil disobedience, right? So um, social contract theory sort of seems to make legality and morality synonymous, right? So if it's true that laws are just rules that human societies decide on, right? And the moral rules are just the rules that human societies decide on, then it would seem like it's always immoral to break the law, right? Um, but we often think of some of our actual sort of shining examples of morality as people that break the law, right, on, in a principled way, right? So uh, Gandhi, right, protesting the British manipulation of salt prices by his march to the sea. So it was illegal, right, to get salt from the sea, right? And he just led people to violate the law deliberately, right, to protest what he thought was an immoral law. Martin Luther King Jr., right, organized people to violate the various Jim Crow laws that were in the South about where, right, black people could sit on buses and what restaurants they could eat, like that. And we think the whole point of that was that the law was immoral and it was moral to break it, right? Um, and at the time, people worried, right, that at the time the arguments against this sort of civil disobedience was, hey, this is undermining our general respect for the law. It's threatening the social contract, right? Um, and King's own argumentation sometimes seemed to be something like the ends justify the means. It didn't really sort of explicitly engage with social contract theory. But there is a sort of line of argument that you could use in favor of Martin Luther King and Gandhi and forms of civil disobedience. So you could think about it this way, right? The entire point of the social contract is to guarantee certain basic rights and liberties. The point of the social contract is so we could leave the house and go eat lunch without worrying about getting beaten up or robbed. But if the laws of the country, right, are no longer protecting those rights for you, um, then as a rational person, would you want to enter into that contract, right? So at the time, right, the laws that Martin Luther King Jr. was protesting, black people couldn't in the South just go have lunch wherever they wanted. There were segregation laws, right? If they acted as though they had those rights, they would get beaten up, right? So the social contract wasn't doing its job for them at that time. And as rational beings, they wouldn't have agreed to that social contract, right? So for them, it didn't represent morality. Um, Other objections to the social contract. Um, I mean, you might wonder this is all so hypothetical. Like, what contract are we talking about? Obviously, no one ever got together and signed a social contract back in a state of nature. It's this sort of hypothetical contract among hypothetical rational people that never existed, right? And sort of one quote from a philosopher is like, social contract theory is not worth the paper it's not written on, right? It's not even a real contract. Um, but I mean, it's a funny quote, but it's not necessarily an insuperable objection, right? So the idea of the social contract is a sort of a guide to determining what rules are moral. So just because it's hypothetical doesn't necessarily mean it's a problem. It's a sort of a procedure for finding the right rules, right? So, you can speculate on what rules society would agree on, right? And any actual societies, which are largely, we're far from perfectly rational, we're far from perfectly self-interested. So actual societal rules will probably diverge from true morality, but we can sort of set it as a benchmark, right? And then finally, last slide. This is going to be a mercifully short lecture. Uh, Another more serious sort of objection to social contract theory is that there are lots of beings that cannot enter into a mutually beneficial contract with us. And if so, then according to social contract theory, we have no moral obligations towards those people, right? So the types of beings that can't enter into a social contract are non-human animals, right? Your dog, your cat, cows, um, babies, right? Future generations, people that don't exist yet, right? Um, or populations that are so oppressed that they cannot sort of like get into these contracts, right? So if I want to torture cats for fun, social contract theory doesn't seem to be able to say there's anything wrong with that, right? The cat can enter into a social contract with me. I have no moral obligation to the cat. Um, it also seems to say that we can't, there's nothing wrong with, right, burning all the fossil fuels, ruining the environment, running up the national debt, and letting the other future generations worry about it, right? Because again, they don't exist yet. They can't enter into a social contract with us. Um, it also seems to entail that, like, if I don't need to enter a contract with you, right? If I feel safe enough that I can kind of whoop you in any fight we get into, right? Um, then I don't owe you anything morally either, right? I can abuse you if I don't deem you worthy of entering into a social contract. So um, this is a much more serious objection to social contract theory, and I haven't provided any response on behalf of the social contract theorists because this could be an interesting paper to write if you wanted to defend social contract theory against this objection. All right, well, that is enough for this week, and next week will be the final week. And if anything comes up, email me, right? Office hours, I'm here.